it's Sarah, and welcome back to Grit Unleashed, where we tackle today together so that tomorrow can be ours. I'm your host, and I am joined here with Dr. Alla. Dr. Alla, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners here about why you're here, what you do, a little bit about you, so that we can get to know you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here and to be part of this podcast. A little bit about myself. So I am a clinical psychologist. I specialize in the treatment of trauma and substance abuse, and I work with a wide range of people, different populations, but particularly with medical doctors and healthcare workers. And this was particularly relevant to some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, given that I was working with this population at the start of the pandemic. In addition to my clinical work, I also serve as COO of Ukraine NGO Coordination Network, which is an incredible network of teams from essentially all over the world, but primarily United States, Ukraine, and Europe, who deliver aid to Ukraine in the time during the full-scale Russian invasion. So I'm really excited to talk about my experience and answer maybe some of the questions that you may be having.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so excited to hear about this. Why don't you also tell the readers, explain a little bit about what the Ukrainian NGO is?
Sure, absolutely. So we are essentially a network of now about 60 different organizations who coordinate together in order to try to deliver humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And this includes aid at different levels. We have cases where somebody may have access to supplies, but may not have access to transportation. And we all come together and really help facilitate the connection so that aid is delivered more smoothly and effectively to people who need it the most. We've been doing this work since the full-scale invasion started. From the very beginning, there were teams on the ground helping evacuate civilians and helping kind of coordinate relief efforts, and have since continued to do that. We have shifted some of the work from more acute phases to more kind of like sustainability and more recovery phase, but we've been there from the beginning.
Wow, and you've been assisting the NGO network since the beginning, since the initial invasion of Ukraine?
So I got connected with UNCN within a few weeks when the invasion happened, particularly through a colleague in one of the organizations who was helping me evacuate my own family. I was looking for support to try to get my family, who's currently in Ukraine, out of immediate danger, and was connected with this incredible network and was able to get my family to safety at the time, and stayed on to try to help with further evacuations, first through contacts, friends, connections, colleagues, and then stayed on to help people that I didn't know. And it was quite a meaningful and powerful experience. But as the evacuations slowed down, I shifted some of the work to more connecting with new organizations, connecting smaller grassroots organizations with bigger organizations to try to really help share resources and streamline operations. So yeah, I've been doing this work since the very beginning.
Wow, that's incredible. Do you mind to talk a little bit about your experience evacuating from Ukraine?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. It was quite a unique experience for me. I have, prior to this, I've, been a civilian, have never been involved in any conflict area. This was very, very new. I've done humanitarian work, mostly as a psychologist within the United States, working with people seeking asylum, particularly survivors of torture. But beyond that, I have never worked within a war zone. So this was definitely something new. I had to learn on the fly, so to say. And it felt really, really powerful and really, really challenging, because I would see people sort of in the moments where trauma was happening. I'm kind of used to working with people after they're already in a safe environment, and I often see the aftermath of trauma. But this was the first time I experienced it in real time, and trying to kind of figure out how to help people evaluate their options while they're being traumatized. That was a huge challenge. And there were a lot of things that I noticed in how people were responding to traumatic experiences in the moment that really, I think, informs my clinical work going forward and really impacts kind of the work that I do in this area.
So before the invasion, were you also doing psychology? And how did the invasion change how you applied that to your practice if you were?
Yes, so I've been a clinical psychologist now since graduation about 8, 9 years, and I've been practicing in various settings, primarily in the hospital settings, but also currently in my own practice. I would say that the war has really, I think, helped me look at traumatic experiences a little bit different and better understand some of the things that people might be dealing with during their traumas and some of the decision making that goes into trying to keep oneself alive, trying to keep oneself safe. Really, a lot of hard choices in the moment. One of the things that I regularly saw was a division that happened within families where the younger generation was ready to go, was ready to move to safety, whereas their parents and often grandparents really struggled with that and were more cautious or felt like it was unsafe to move, and it caused a lot of division, a lot of challenges. And it's hard to say because there's no guarantee that moving somebody will actually keep them safe. So certainly that was something I saw a lot.
I just, I cannot imagine how hard that would be. I mean, sitting here in the States where we haven't had that. And I just, I really commend the effort and the work that you're doing and you going through that experience is it's such a concept for somebody like me who hasn't, and I'm sure many of our listeners, or at least, some of our listeners haven't had that experience firsthand. So I really just add that is incredibly strong to not only go through it yourself, but also help other people through it.
Thank you so much for saying that. And part of actually what inspired me to do this is the people that I saw within this network, most of whom had no connection to Ukraine prior to the invasion, had their own lives, jobs, families, who volunteered their time, really this like precious time that we have in order to help complete strangers. And that genuinely inspired me and helped me realize that very often we think there's nothing we can do about a conflict that's so far away. Like, what can we do sitting here? And yet, so much of the work was happening remotely by people who were distant. Certainly, there's ton and ton of people who are in the heat of danger, who are there on the ground, but also a lot of people who are supporting them from afar. So that actually helped me have a little bit more hope for the future, and that as things happen all over the world, there's actually a lot that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of connections, I meant to ask, how did you get linked up with Nacho on all of this?
So Nacho is actually one of the founders of UNCN, which is part of, so the network itself is part of his organization. So he's really, the founder of this, and he helped establish this incredible network and made such a difference for so many people. He's got so many projects and does so many incredible things, helping so many people. Certainly is one of a number of things that he's been doing, but I'm incredibly grateful to him for, founding this network.
Yeah, he really does. He has his hands in a lot of pots out there. So before we kind of address how this whole event have affected you, we want to talk about the difference between PTSD and also moral injury. So can you explain to our listeners where that dividing line is and the difference between the two?
Sure, absolutely. It's a really good question because the two conditions often travel together, but there is a slight yet important distinction. Even though they're both pretty severe psychological conditions, they do differ in their origins and manifestations. Particularly, PTSD usually occurs from exposure to life-threatening events or traumatic experiences, either directly or witnessed. And this in turn leads to symptoms such as flashbacks, hyperarousal, and avoidance behaviors. And what that means is whenever people experience trauma and have PTSD as a result, they want to avoid any thoughts or reminders of the painful experiences that have happened. In contrast, moral injury comes from actions or experiences that violate the person's moral or ethical beliefs. So it's a little bit less of something that happens to them, and is more connected to either actions they've taken or things they have witnessed. And this causes profound feelings of guilt, shame, and betrayal. And although those feelings often coexist within PTSD as well, they really are a hallmark of moral injury, where PTSD is primarily driven by fear and anxiety that's related to the trauma. Moral injury involves a deep internal conflict and a sense of moral transgression.
What are maybe some examples that you've seen of both moral injury and PTSD manifesting in people, specifically the ones that you have worked with, mentioning soldiers, humanitarian workers, anybody else that you've had any work with?
Sure, absolutely. So, for example, in military members, PTSD can happen from participating in active combat, from witnessing colleagues getting injured, from being injured themselves, whereas moral injury often occurs when they witness or participate in any actions that conflict with their moral beliefs, such as observing any kind of harm to civilians or failing to prevent some kind of atrocities. Somewhat parallel to that, humanitarian aid workers who are often in the same front lines can experience moral injury when they're unable to save lives due to resource constraints or when they witness human suffering without being able to intervene. This makes it really, really challenging to kind of reconcile their goals and their deeply held values with what's happening on the ground. In terms of medical doctors, and I saw this a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, moral injury can occur from making decisions that tend to prioritize certain patients over others, either due to resources or from perceived failures to save lives despite their best efforts. With the pandemic being something so new for most doctors, they have never experienced anything like this. It was very hard to see patients that otherwise should have been doing well, or patients that were young and shouldn't have been dying. It was really, really hard for many doctors to try to do everything they can to save them and not be able to. In that sense, moral injury is a little bit different than PTSD, where there isn't maybe as much of a direct threat to the person who's experiencing it. And a lot of these experiences led to intense feelings of guilt and shame, as I mentioned, and a sense of moral failure, a sense of hopelessness, and kind of a disconnect with one's calling and profession, which often is a big aspect of a person's identity.
So, what are maybe some of the parallels between treatment for those? How do they align and how are they different?
So that's a really good question. I think there's a number of things that are effective for both PTSD and moral injury. So maybe first I'll start by talking about some of the difference. Treatments for PTSD often focus on managing fear and the trauma response itself. And that happens through methods such as cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, exposure therapy, and EMDR, which is all kind of forms of getting a person to reduce avoidance and to minimize the symptoms themselves through exposure. And the more the person's exposed to, in a controlled setting, to some of the feared thoughts and feared experiences, the less power these thoughts and experiences have. In contrast, addressing moral injury involves processing a little bit deeper feelings of guilt and shame. And often this can be done through more narrative therapies, moral repair, and really focusing on fostering forgiveness and self-compassion. Whereas very often when somebody experiences PTSD, it's not that there's a blame happening, but it's certainly not their fault that something happened, and really helping them understand that and build compassion. That's one of the ways in which both of the conditions can be treated similarly. I think really helping the person understand where their own agency lies, where they have a little bit more control in their experiences. It's really important to recognize the unique aspect of moral injury, and this helps mental health professionals to really tailor their interventions to address the more ethical and moral dimensions of the injury itself, and thus create more comprehensive treatments. I'm also happy to kind of share some of the recommendations in terms of the type of treatments that can be helpful. For example, it's really important to create a safe and non-judgmental space, in both cases for people struggling with PTSD and moral injury. It really helps encourage open discussion about the person's experience without fear of judgment and condemnation. And the reason that's so important is because shame very much perpetuates a lot of the symptoms that we have discussed. Shame makes it hard to recover and keeps the person kind of stuck in this very painful loop. Narrative therapy can be really helpful in terms of processing a person's experience by telling stories, really having control over their narrative, over their experience. And it can really help in understanding and integrating the event.
So not all hope is lost is what you're saying, and that's
Oh,
great. That things,
of course.
yeah, yeah, that things can be you know, there is hope, even though, somebody may not feel like they've done everything they could, or, they suffered, as you said, at the hands of a trauma. So how, if you don't mind me asking, and we always hear at UT2, never want anybody to feel like they have to talk about anything they don't want to, but how have either of these conditions affected you with, your evacuation and also dealing with the humanitarian efforts, not only during the invasion of Ukraine, but also during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think there's definitely some parallels, although, quite different situations. I do think in both, I found myself supporting the people on the front lines, but not maybe so directly affected. And part of what was challenging about that is it also contributes to some feelings of guilt, like survivor's guilt, particularly of being so far away and of seeing incredible people like the doctors on the front line and the humanitarian workers going into kind of the heat of the fire and really helping people directly while I'm supporting them from afar. And that has been a little bit challenging. I think there's certainly I done a lot of work to kind of understand my own sense of guilt and shame for being safe in these situations and for being somewhat removed from the conflicts themselves, particularly in Ukraine, given that family and friends are in direct danger and hardship. It can feel a little bit hard, watching this from afar and feeling like, okay, there's a lot that I'm doing, but certainly not, not as hands-on involved as someone who's there on the ground. This has been particularly challenging. I can share an example just, last week there was a significant bombing of Kiev, particularly the biggest children's medical center was hit and severely damaged. And that was quite challenging because I myself was essentially born in that hospital. And in addition to that, a rocket had hit my kindergarten. So it was kind of hard to watch sort of these aspects of my childhood and my own identity be destroyed, but also not be there on the ground to help deliver water, to do kind of the recovery efforts. I think that part is certainly hard to balance.
Yeah, wow. And I'm sorry to hear that. I have thoughts. But
Sure.
um so what are some things that you are doing to combat those feelings and those triggers that happen to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that's been most helpful is community and family connection. So really getting connected with other people who are sharing similar experiences, who are going through similar things. And I find that activism is really, really an effective way to combat those feelings of helplessness and powerlessness. So organizing communities, getting involved with volunteer organizations like UNCN to really, even though I'm not there on the ground, maybe I can help connect the person on the ground with somebody who can deliver the water to them. I think that has really, really helped feel a little bit more in control of a situation and certainly helps manage some of those feelings at bay.
That's awesome. I'm really glad that you've been able to figure a way through that. Not that I had any doubts that you could, but just really it's like a beacon of hope through these things that happen to these people. And especially, do you still have family and friends that are in the areas that are affected?
Yes, absolutely. So my father is in Kiev, and I do have a couple of aunts and uncles there as well as like close friends, somebody I grew up with. I would say we knew each other from age two. So really, really close friends who are almost like family. There are quite a few people still there.
And how are they doing?
I mean, they're certainly struggling. I think it's really they're incredibly resilient. So certainly people are functioning, they're going to work, they're trying to maintain their lives as much as possible, but there's a tremendous sense of uncertainty about the future. Are things going to get worse? Are their loved ones going to be okay? It's really, really hard to kind of exist in that space. So I feel for them tremendously.
Yeah. And where did you relocate to after you were evacuated?
Uh, so I so I myself wasn't evacuated. I was born in Ukraine, but I had immigrated when I was 10 years old to New York, and that's where I grew up and essentially had my whole life here. So I'm still in New York City. That's kind of
Oh,
my
okay. Okay, sorry. I for some reason thought that you had just been evacuated recently, so
No, 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 no. It just so happened that I got connected with the evacuation efforts as I was trying to help out my family. But I grew up here, so it's been my whole life. It's been now, oh goodness, over 26 years.
long time to live in if you lived in New York City your whole life
Hmm.
or just different parts of New York?
Yes. So I have lived in different parts of New York, but I've never left the city.
Ah, okay. Do you like living in New York City?
I do. I do. I think it's such a unique place. It's really unlike anywhere else. I find it amazing that we can go from one neighborhood to another and really get access to all kinds of food, all kinds of cultural events and experiences. It really does feel sometimes like being in the center. So I do enjoy that very much.
So that is a lot different from what you might get in Ukraine.
It is different, even though, so I was born in the capital, so it is like a big city center. It's got a different pace than New York. It's certainly a little bit slower and much calmer prior to the war. It's definitely a very, very different pace. In New York, everyone's always moving, everything has to be quick. In that sense, sometimes I do find myself thinking if maybe a slower pace or a slower place could be beneficial because sometimes it's go, go, go here.
Yeah, the city that never sleeps, right?
Yep.
So, one of the other questions I wanted to ask is what is your perspective on grit, especially coming from the Ukrainian environment, from, I think most of our listeners, if not all, are, only have the perspective of the US. So, I wanted to use this time as a time to hopefully provide the listeners with a different perspective and what that might be like if we've never had that perspective of the outside.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's so many things that can be reflective of grit. Just looking at the Ukrainian population, I think they've really come to embody that word. Just seeing how the communities come together and support each other and fight for their freedom, fight for their independence, really like to protect their identity, to protect the culture. I think that's reflective of incredible courage and resolve. And I think it really embodies this idea of grit. So that's certainly something I've seen a lot of. And I've seen people who are in awful circumstances who lose everything, really kind of come together and say, you know what, I can help somebody else. There's still a lot to rebuild and really kind of focus on having hope for the future. I think that's been inspirational.
Yeah, and I really like what you said whenever you said that these people really, they just continuously fight for not only just their independence, but for their identity. And I think that's something here in the US that we lack is because usually we're so removed and dislocated from the main conflicts that are happening that we really I mean, I know I can at least speak for myself in saying that I really don't know what that's like personally. And, even as a service member, that being something that I'm very passionate about, I've never had to fight for something as my identity as an American. I was born and raised here. So I think that's a really sobering perspective to bring up.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that even though that's true, there hasn't been conflict in the US for a really long time, which I think is wonderful. I do think that that grit is there. And the reason why I feel that is when I was growing up in New York, so when I had just started high school, was when we had 9/11. And I witnessed most of what was happening. My school was relatively close, and seeing how people came together and seeing people kind of connect over not just their sense as New Yorkers, their identity as New Yorkers, but also as Americans. I certainly feel that that's there. And I think that that was also something that helped me move forward, move past that trauma itself, and really have hope. I do think as Americans, we are able to come together in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of places. And what I really find inspirational is how many people are willing to help others, how many people are willing to help strangers. I think that part is in a lot of ways unique within American culture. So many individuals who built these NGOs, who went on the ground in Ukraine and in Turkey after the earthquake, in Haiti, they're American born without any other connection to those regions, and yet they go to try to help a complete stranger. To me, that's incredible, and I think very reflective of the American spirit.
Yes, absolutely. And I was about 12 whenever 9/11 happened. I was in the fifth grade. Gosh, I remember whenever that happened. I was riding the bus. I was in like the extra like talented and gifted program. And the
Mm.
particular day that it happened was the day that I went to the high school to meet up with my fellow talented and gifted people. And I remember there was a frenzy in the library as I'm like coming in, setting my stuff down, my book bag and all that. And the librarian rolls in the TV and we're like watching it happen, right? Because they at this point they had already hit the first tower, and then sure enough, we see the second aircraft hit the second tower. And at 12 years old, I had no idea really what that meant. And they sent us all home from school, and I mean, we definitely came together as a country. So you're right,
Yeah.
we do. There have been times whenever we have had to come together as a country. I think just sometimes maybe it's hard to see these days, especially now
Mhm.
that we have a whole generation that was born and they are now in their adult phase of life after that event happened.
Yeah, it is definitely strange to think that there's an entire group of adults that was just a historical event they read about in books. I think that definitely is an interesting thing to reflect on. But I'm hopeful. I know there's a lot of division, but I'm hopeful that there is some way to kind of regain that sense of unity and that sense of connection. And I certainly see a lot of people wanting to help out others. I think that value is very present, even in the next generation. Or maybe I'm just being optimistic, but I really do believe so.
Oh no, I totally agree. Of course, every generation has, their cons, their pros and cons about them. The hope is that every generation is going to improve on what the previous generation failed at, right? So, things like mental health, exactly what this podcast is all about, are things that are very up and coming in the generations that are existing today that were not very well, I guess, let's say advertised or accepted
Mhm.
with previous generations. So I know that gives me hope.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's huge. I've certainly seen there be a lot of reduction of stigma, even though it is still highly stigmatized. People are a lot more open to talk about their mental health struggles, to seek help and support. I think that can only continue to improve, and I really do hope that does continue to, build forward and become more accessible. I'm with you on that.
Absolutely. Dr. Alla, it's been great to have you on the show. I know we've been trying to make this happen, gosh, for the last month and a half. And finally, we were able to sit down and have this wonderful chat. And I'm just really glad to have you on the show. And really, I just really think the work that you're doing out there is very cool.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And thank you for having this, I think, important discussion about mental health. I'm really happy to kind of offer my experience and expertise. And I really appreciate your time. And thank you to the listeners.
Yes, thank you so much for your time, and our listeners, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for always supporting us
Thank you
in
for having me.
these podcasts that we do. We really appreciate you guys and all that you do. So until next time here on Grit Unleashed, this is Sarah, and we've had Dr. Alla today, and we will listen to